It won't go away until I die. That sentence was spoken by a 57-year-old man standing at a press conference in Mineola, New York in March of 2026. He did not say it with drama. He did not say it for effect. He said it the way a person states a fact they have long since stopped fighting. A truth they have simply learned to carry. He was 5 years old when the image was made. 5 years old when he stepped off his kindergarten bus on an ordinary January afternoon and walked toward his house the way he had walked toward his house every single day of his short life. And found something inside that no child should ever find. Something that burned itself into the back of his mind so permanently that more than half a century later, standing in front of cameras with the answer finally in hand, the most honest thing he could say was that it would never leave him. This is the story of Barbara Waldman. A 31-year-old mother, a devoted wife, a woman who filled every room she entered with something warm and alive. Murdered in her own home on January 11, 1974 in Oceanside, Long Island. A case that went cold for 52 years. A family that carried the weight of unanswered questions, community suspicion, and unresolved grief for the entirety of their adult lives. And a blue bathrobe that waited in a sealed evidence box through 5 decades of silence, 2 administrations of science, and the complete transformation of human knowledge, until the moment the world finally caught up with what it contained. If this story is new to you, you need to stay with me for every single second of this video. Because what investigators did to finally crack this case is one of the most extraordinary applications of modern forensic science ever applied to a cold case anywhere in America. Hit that like button right now. Share this video immediately because Barbara Waldman deserves to have her story seen by as many people as possible. Subscribe to Black Veil Crime Files with notifications on because cases like this one are exactly why this channel exists. And stay until the very last second because the moment those 3 children stood at that press conference after 52 years is something you will carry with you long after this video ends. Let us go back to the beginning. Oceanside, Long Island, January 11, 1974. Oceanside in 1974 was a portrait of American suburban life so familiar it almost felt scripted. Streets lined with colonial homes. Driveways with station wagons. Children who went to the same schools their parents had attended. Families who had been neighbors long enough that they stopped knocking before coming through the back door. It was the kind of place where the word community still meant something tangible. A shared responsibility. A looking out for each other that did not need to be discussed because it was simply understood. The house on the 3900 block of Sally Lane belonged to Jerry and Barbara Waldman. Jerry was a dentist. Local, well-liked, the kind of man people described in one word. Steady. Barbara was different from steady. Barbara was 31 years old. An NYU graduate, which was not a small thing for a woman of her generation. She had long blonde hair and a laugh that made everyone in the room feel like they were in on the joke. She was always singing. Always moving. The kind of mother who got down on the floor with her children not because she felt obligated to but because she genuinely wanted to. She had 3 of them. Mara, 7. Larry, 6. And Eric, who had just turned 5. She volunteered with the Oceanside Cancer Society. She showed up for her neighbors. She was active in the community in a way that was not performative. She believed that being part of something larger than your own household mattered. The neighbors on Sally Lane knew her well. They knew the sound of her laugh through an open window on a summer afternoon. They knew that her house was warm in a way that went beyond the thermostat. On the morning of January 11, 1974, the children got ready for school. Backpacks, breakfast, the minor chaos of getting 3 children under 8 out the door when nobody wanted to put their coat on. Mara and Larry left for school. Eric climbed onto the kindergarten bus. He was a half-day student, which meant he would be home before the others. Jerry left for his dental practice. And Barbara Waldman was alone in the house on Sally Lane. She was wearing a nightgown and a blue bathrobe. A quiet morning. A slow one. The kind where the children are out the door and you allow yourself the luxury of not rushing for once. She had no reason to be afraid. Somewhere on those same streets, less than 4 miles away, a 26-year-old man was already moving through that same morning. He worked sanitation in Oceanside. He knew these streets. He may have stood at the end of that very driveway, done the most unremarkable job in the world, and watched the rhythms of that household from the most invisible vantage point imaginable. Nobody noticed him. Nobody had any reason to. That was the point. What Eric found. There are things a 5-year-old brain cannot process all at once. Not because the child is not intelligent, but because the human mind at any age was not built to absorb certain things without warning. It slows down. It stalls. It attempts to process information that has no frame of reference, no category, no place to go. Eric Waldman stepped off his kindergarten bus sometime around midday and walked toward his house the way he had walked toward his house every day of his short life. The front door. The steps. The smell of home. Everything exactly where it was supposed to be. Except it was not. Inside, the house was wrong in a way Eric could not name. The television was off when it should not have been. The kitchen was empty. The particular hum of a home with someone in it, that low constant presence that children feel without knowing they feel it, was gone. He moved through the first floor. Then toward the stairs. The second floor hallway. The door to his parents' bedroom. And there, in the flash of blue from his mother's bathrobe, the world ended for him. Barbara Waldman was lying face down on the floor beside her bed. She had been restrained. The scene was one of deliberate and calculated violence, contained within that single room. She had sustained a single fatal injury. She was 31 years old. The house had not been ransacked. No broken glass. No overturned furniture. No evidence of a struggle that extended beyond that one room. From the outside, from the street, from the casual glance of anyone passing by, nothing about the house on Sally Lane suggested that anything had happened there at all. That detail would matter enormously 50 years later. The investigation, 1974. Authorities arrived and immediately recognized that this was not an accident. The quiet street began filling with police vehicles and the charged stillness that descends on a neighborhood when something unspeakable has occurred. Investigators documented everything they found. A biological sample recovered from Barbara's blue bathrobe. Preserved, sealed, filed. A fingerprint recovered inside the residence. Eyewitness accounts from neighbors who reported seeing a man moving quickly away from the house. Conspicuous enough to register but not conspicuous enough to stop. From those accounts, a composite sketch was drawn. A face, a general build, something to work from. But 1974 was 1974. The biological sample could not be tested. The fingerprint could not be matched to anyone. The sketch was just a drawing. The science that would eventually solve this case had not been invented yet. It would not be invented for decades. Jerry Waldman was called from his dental practice. He came home to a house full of police and an absence where his wife had been that morning. And sometime in the chaos of that afternoon, he had to find the words. He gathered all 3 children. Mara. Larry. Eric, who had already seen something no 5-year-old should see. Already carrying something no 5-year-old should carry. He told them a bad man had come into the house. He told them their mom was in heaven. He told them she was not coming home. Mara would recall those words more than 50 years later with perfect clarity. Not because they were perfect words, but because they were the last sentence of the life the Waldman children had known. And the first sentence of the life they would now have to build without her. The whispers that followed an innocent man. Detectives looked at the locks. No forced entry. They looked at the house. Nothing taken. Nothing ransacked. They looked at the husband. A dentist. Steady. Working that morning. An alibi that was uncomplicated and clean. Too uncomplicated, some people thought. Because in the absence of an arrest, in the absence of a name, the mind of a community reaches for an explanation closer to home. Something that fits inside the frame of what people already know. Something that restores the feeling that violence has logic. That it does not just walk in off the street without reason. And so the whispers began. Not loudly. They never do. They move through the neighborhood the way rumors always move. Sideways. In the spaces between conversations. In the hesitation before a sentence. In looks exchanged across a room that said everything without saying anything at all. The husband was not home. The wife was dead. That was enough. Jerry Waldman did not run. He did not leave Oceanside. He did not retreat from public life. He went back to work. He raised his 3 children. He became, in the years that followed, what his daughter Mara would later describe as a well-loved member of the Oceanside community. A man who showed up and kept going and carried the weight of an impossible situation with a dignity that never fully received the recognition it deserved. But dignity does not silence rumors. And the children heard them. Mara, Larry, and Eric grew up inside that cloud. Their mother's pictures came down off the walls, packed away, not displayed. The family did not talk about what had happened because there was no language adequate to the conversation and no resolution to give it a place to land. They grew up hearing periodically that some people suspected their father. That cruelty, the suggestion that the only parent they had left was somehow responsible for the void at the center of their lives, proved to be one of the most lasting injuries the case inflicted on them. Not the only one. But one of the deepest. 50 years of false hope. The investigation moved forward on the tools available to it. The composite sketch circulated. Leads were followed. The case was pursued with the urgency that homicide investigations command in their early months. But months became years. No arrest came. The biological sample, the fingerprint, the bathrobe sat in storage, waiting for a science that had not yet been invented. The case went cold. And then the false hopes began. At some point in the years that followed, a man serving time in prison came forward with a confession. He claimed responsibility for Barbara Waldman's death. For a family that had spent years waiting for exactly this kind of break, that confession must have felt like the beginning of the end of the waiting. DNA testing proved it false. The man who confessed had never been on Sally Lane. Then investigators turned their attention to a 1968 homicide in Valley Stream, a community not far from Oceanside, whose circumstances bore enough similarity to the Waldman case that a connection seemed worth pursuing. Perhaps the same offender. Perhaps a pattern. DNA testing ruled that out as well. Known violent offenders whose paths had crossed through Long Island were methodically scrutinized and eliminated. Each thread cut. Each door closed. Each moment where the family braced themselves for resolution only receiving the continuation of uncertainty. In 2004, Nassau County detectives formally submitted a DNA sample from Jerry Waldman for testing. He was excluded. Completely and unambiguously excluded. The biological evidence from the crime scene did not match Jerry Waldman. It had never been his. The science said clearly what 52 years of grief and suspicion had refused to settle. The man who had been whispered about for 30 years had nothing to do with his wife's death. There was another contributor. A man whose DNA was on that bathrobe. Unidentified. Still unknown. Jerry Waldman died in 2007. He never knew who killed his wife. And somewhere less than 4 miles from Sally Lane, Thomas Generazio was still alive. Still living in the same community where he had committed the crime. Living out the consequence-free years that Barbara Waldman's children were spending in the wreckage of what he had done. He would die of cancer in 2004, the same year Jerry Waldman was formally cleared. He believed he would take his secret with him. Some evidence does not expire. The bathrobe that waited 50 years. Some were in a Nassau County evidence storage facility, through administrations and decades and retirements and the cycling through of entire generations of investigators, sat a sealed cardboard box. Inside it, among other items documented on January 11, 1974, was a blue bathrobe. A blue bathrobe that had been carefully preserved for 50 years. Outside that box, the world had transformed beyond recognition. Men had walked on the moon. The Cold War had ended. The internet had been built and then put in everyone's pocket. Entire fields of science had been invented, refined, and reinvented. The human genome had been sequenced. Consumer ancestry databases containing the DNA of millions of ordinary people had been built by companies whose founders had not yet been born on January 11, 1974. The bathrobe waded through all of it. In 2022, Mara Waldman was watching a documentary. Newsday investigative reporter Sandra Petty had spent years examining more than 100 women murdered on Long Island whose cases remained unsolved. That investigation became a documentary called The Forgotten, broadcast on WLIW. Mara saw it and reached out. The combination of journalistic attention and a family that had spent decades refusing to stop asking questions created enough pressure that investigators took another look. What they found when they looked again in 2023 with tools that had not existed before was that the science had genuinely changed. With FBI assistance, Nassau County investigators developed what had previously been impossible. A full and comprehensive DNA profile from the biological sample on Barbara's bathrobe. Not partial. Not incomplete. A complete genetic profile of the unknown contributor. A biological identity, precise and detailed, belonging to the man who had been in that bedroom more than 4 decades earlier. They had him. They just did not know who he was yet. The science that solved what 50 years could not. In 2024, Nassau County authorities partnered with Oldham, a private forensic genetics laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas, built specifically to extract usable genetic information from evidence that conventional methods had failed on. Oldham scientists applied a process called forensic-grade genome sequencing. This is not a standard database search. It does not require the suspect's DNA to already exist in a government system. Instead, it sequences the full genome of the unknown contributor and builds a profile detailed enough to compare against consumer ancestry databases. The same databases that millions of ordinary people have voluntarily contributed to in order to find distant relatives. The principle is elegant in its simplicity. You do not need to find the exact person. You need to find someone related to them. A cousin. A second cousin. Someone who shares enough genetic material that investigators can begin building a family tree. And then by working forward and backward through generations of public records, narrow the tree until only one person could be the source of the original sample. In August of 2024, a partial DNA match surfaced. Not a direct hit. Not a name. Just a signal. A partial alignment between the profile from the bathrobe and the DNA of someone in a genealogy database. A thread. The beginning of a trail. FBI forensic genealogists began constructing family trees from that partial match. Interviewing relatives. Mapping connections. Cross-referencing names against public records, property records, employment records, death certificates. Working backward through decades. Eliminating branches. Narrowing slowly and methodically toward a single point of origin. That point had a name. Thomas Generazio. Born February 1, 1947. Oceanside, New York. Not a neighboring town. Not a different county. Oceanside. The same community where Barbara Waldman had lived and died. A few blocks from the house on Sally Lane. The man who had been there all along. Thomas Generazio was a sanitation worker for the Oceanside Sanitation Department. Which meant he had driven those streets professionally. Been a routine and invisible presence in that neighborhood. Moved through the community in a role so ordinary that no one would have thought twice about seeing him there. Investigators noted carefully that it was possible Generazio had at some point been the Waldman family's own garbage collector. That he may have stood at the end of their driveway, done the most unremarkable job in the world, and watched the rhythms of that household from the most invisible vantage point imaginable. He had been arrested twice. Once for assault. Once for possession of stolen property. 2 encounters with law enforcement that in a different era would have placed his DNA into a database that would have matched the bathrobe evidence decades earlier. But in the years those arrests occurred, DNA collection was not standard practice. His genetic profile had never entered any system. He had never been a suspect. He had never been questioned. He had never, as far as the public record shows, come within reach of the investigation at any point across 5 decades. And the composite sketch drawn in 1974 from the accounts of neighbors who had seen a man near the Waldman home that morning was described 50 years later, when investigators finally had a face to compare it to, as almost a perfect match. He had been in the data all along. In the sketch. In the neighborhood. In the evidence preserved on a bathrobe in a box in a storage facility that had been waiting with the patience that only inanimate things can sustain for exactly this moment. Thomas Generazio died of cancer in 2004 at the age of 57. He had lived out the remainder of his life in the same community where he had committed the crime. He had never been charged. Never questioned. Never forced to account for what he had done to Barbara Waldman and to the 3 children who spent the rest of their lives in the aftermath of that January morning. But the bathrobe had waited. And now it had a name. The phone call and the press conference. The phone call came sometime in 2024. Not a press conference. Not a formal announcement. Just a phone call, the kind that Mara Waldman had spent 50 years half expecting and half convinced would never actually come. Detective Chino on the other end of the line. A pause. And then 4 words that collapsed 5 decades of waiting into a single moment. We have a match. Mara fell to the floor. Not figuratively. Not as an expression. Her legs gave out beneath her the way they do when the body receives information the mind has been bracing against for so long that the sudden release of that tension has nowhere to go except down. She flew to New York. She sat across from investigators and heard for the first time a complete account of who Thomas Generazio was. A sanitation worker. Born 1947. Oceanside. A few blocks away. She had never heard his name in her life. There was no buried memory of a face or a voice or an encounter that rearranged itself into something sinister in hindsight. He was simply a stranger. A stranger who had entered their home, destroyed their family, and returned to his ordinary life and lived it out to its conclusion while the Waldman children spent their entire adulthoods in the wreckage of what he had done. On March 11, 2026, Nassau County Police Commissioner Patrick Ryder stood at a podium in Mineola and said what the Waldman family had been waiting 52 years to hear. Beside him stood FBI agents. And the 3 Waldman siblings. 3 adults in their late 50s who had once been 5, 6, and 7 years old when their world collapsed on a January morning on Sally Lane. What 52 years actually costs. Mara spoke first at that press conference. Her voice was steady in the way that voices become steady not from the absence of emotion but from the long discipline of containing it. From 52 years of practice at holding something enormous inside a frame small enough to function in daily life. She spoke about growing up with a void where their mother should have been. About the rumors that had followed their father. About the particular cruelty of watching a good man carry a stigma he had done nothing to earn. And then she said what she had been waiting her entire life to say. Happily today, 52 years later, I get to say to the world that our father, Jerry Waldman, is exonerated. He was a victim, not a villain. Jerry Waldman had died in 2007. He had not lived to hear those words spoken publicly. He had not lived to see his name formally cleared. He had not lived to know that the science had finally done what the investigation could not do in his lifetime. He went to his grave carrying the weight of 3 decades of suspicion alongside his grief. Two burdens that should never have been his to carry at all. Mara said the words for him. Into the record. In front of cameras. For anyone who had ever doubted. Larry spoke about what surviving this loss had made him. Not with bitterness, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing of all. He said that losing his mother so suddenly at 6 years old, without explanation or resolution, had probably made him a better father to his daughter. A better partner. Someone who understood in the bone-deep way that only real loss teaches that the people in front of you are not guaranteed to be there tomorrow. Eric said very little. He did not need to. He had already said the thing that contained everything. The sentence that required no elaboration and admitted no softening. I have had the image of my mom in my head since I was 5. And it won't go away until I die. That is the true cost of January 11th, 1974. Not just a life taken. But a wound opened in a 5-year-old boy that would never, regardless of press conferences or DNA matches or identified suspects, fully close. The identification of Thomas Generazio gave Eric Waldman answers. It gave him truth. It did not give him back the image in his head. Nothing could do that. Commissioner Ryder did not speak in careful language at that podium. He said they would have liked to see Generazio in jail for every single year of every decade that the Waldman children had grown up without their mother. He called him an animal. He said it was inexcusable. He said it with the weight of a man who had spent a career in law enforcement and still could not make peace with the fact that some people who commit monstrous acts never face a single consequence for them. Generazio had not spent a single day in a cell. He had not been questioned. He had not been charged. He had not been forced to look at the family he shattered and account for what he had done. He died in the same community where he committed the crime. And the world did not know his name until 22 years after he was already gone. After the press conference, the Waldman siblings went to their mother's grave. They brought a card placed there by the detective who had worked to close the case. On it were words that in the context of everything that had happened over 52 years felt less like a sentiment and more like a statement of purpose. To the living we owe respect. But to the dead we owe only the truth. They placed it on the stone. And they told her it was over. Barbara Waldman was 31 years old. She was an NYU graduate. A devoted mother. A community volunteer. A woman with long blonde hair who laughed with her whole body and filled every room she entered with something warm and alive. She was not a case file. Not a cold case number. Not a sketch on a bulletin board or a sample in an evidence box. She was a person. And 52 years after the morning that took her from the people who loved her most, the truth about what happened to her was finally, fully, and permanently known. It arrived late. But it arrived. And for 3 children who had waited their entire lives for it, it was everything. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that patience and science and a family that refuses to stop asking questions can reach across 50 years and find the truth, please share this video right now. Leave a comment below and tell me what moment in this case stopped you completely cold. Tell me what you think about that composite sketch that was almost a perfect match. Tell me what it means to you that a blue bathrobe waited 50 years to do what the entire investigation could not. Subscribe to Black Veil Crime Files with notifications on. Every case on this channel is a real person. A real family. A real cost that gets paid long after the headlines stop. This is Black Veil Crime Files. I will see you in the next one. Blackheart.